sightings of ghosts, an abandoned insane asylum, creepy ass dolls, werewolves, and witches, honey. Do not obey. Stay woke. Nobody's gonna stop me. This is real. Do not obey. Stay woke. Scary as hell.
Said he walked like an ordinary man at first. Said, but then he stopped and he hunkered down, started smelling the tree trunks, even the foliage, tasting them, all kinds of stuff. Said then he hopped down on his belly, done the same thing. Said Papa said he was both froze and just in pure amazement. Said that fella was sniffing the ground and the leaves, then just stopped. Said he jumped back up to his feet and slowly looked up in the air like he was smelling it. And then he turned and looked Papa right dead in the eye. Said he looked like just an ordinary man with long, dirty hair and a beard. Said but there was something about him, though. Said something you give off a feeling about him that said danger. Said he was just kind of wild looking. Said the man just stared at him. Said then suddenly just turned and burst into a run like he had backed into a porcupine. Said Papa said he was worried that man was going to make a circle up around the ridge and come up part of where he was at. So he took off and cut a trail himself. So I made a promise to stay away from that area. A couple times, I ain't gonna lie to you, out of curiosity, I'd sneak up there, and I'd always get close to it. And the feeling of dread, just danger.
There was this man named Jim. Now, Jim grew up in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in North Carolina. And he said he was the oldest of 5 brothers and sisters. And they lived in this older home situated in the middle of the woods, surrounded by the mountains. Now, he said this one particular night, his father put him in charge of watching his brothers and sisters. Brothers and sisters, they were playing a game of tag, running around the house. When all of a sudden, they hear the doorbell ring. So they all go up to the front door. They look out the window. There's nobody out there. So they go back to playing. And after about 15-20 minutes, once again, they hear the doorbell. They go and look out the window. There's no one there. So they go back to playing again. And once again, the doorbell rings. So this time, Jim goes to the door and he opens it and he goes, "Quit playing around." He looks out there and there is like absolutely no one. And he said he just remembered, like all of a sudden, this very bad stench just poured into the house. And he said it almost made him gag. So he closes the door and they all go into the living room. Well, his brother goes into the kitchen and is in there for about 5 minutes when all of a sudden he comes running out, screaming, crying, and he runs right into his bedroom and jumps on the bed. So Jim goes to check on him and see what's wrong, and when he gets in his brother's room, he can see that like he's very frantic and just, upset by something. He said finally his brother, after about 5-10 minutes, says, "I was in the kitchen and I looked out the window. There was this big, tall, hairy monster and it was waving at me to come outside. And right as he's telling him that story, Jim said he looked out his brother's window and he sees the shadow of something very large just move. And so he tells his brother, like, get out of the room. And he gets his brothers and sisters and he puts them all into the parents' room. Well, he said right at that moment they could hear stuff like running around the house, and they could hear all this noise outside and banging on the windows and the doors. And after about 5 or 10 minutes, he said he hears this frantic banging on the front door. So Jim gets up the courage, he goes to his father's office and he grabs his rifle. He goes to the door, and when he looks out the window, he sees that it's his neighbor. So he opens the door, and the neighbor comes running in and is all frantic and is like, where are the kids? Where's everybody? Like, are you guys all right? I'm staying with you till your dad gets back. And Jim was kind of confused, like, why is the neighbor here? Why is he panicking? Well, shortly after this, his father comes home, and his father and the neighbor go into the other room. Jim overhears them talking, and the neighbor is basically saying to the father, like, I was looking out my window when I seen like several large-looking men that weren't human running around your house, and I knew the kids were alone, so I ran over there immediately, and one of these things, whatever it was, it chased me. So Jim's father and the neighbor, they get some rifles and they go outside. They tell the kids to lock themselves in the bedroom. And he said all night long they could hear just, loud bangs and booms, and shots being fired. And he said the next morning his father came in, had this blank stare on his face, and just slowly shuffled onto the couch. And he asked his father, what was that last night? Like, what happened? And his dad looked at him and said, I never want to speak about what I seen out there.
And so I went to a treatment center, and I was there for about a week. And we had a deal with Caitlin, who was then homeless and staying in our living room. And we said, okay, Caitlin, if you'll take him to AA meetings and keep him sober, I'll go to treatment and get clean. And he dropped me off at the treatment center.
And then I went back home, and the moment I got back home, she took me to go get drugs. So she was supposed to take me to the AA meeting, but instead she took me to go get drugs. And she took me to these people's house, and this is in the mountains. And the thing about like the Appalachians, there's a lot of witchcraft in the Appalachians. A lot of Satanists. It really is. I'm gonna say it's a plague. But so that she took me to these people's house, and when I pulled up, it was like this dirt road that had like a bunch of like ditches. Like you could barely drive on the road. And what's funny is the name of the road was Dueling Banjos Lane. So I don't know if you've ever seen The Deliverance or not, but I don't know why they would name it that. Maybe because they're Satanists and they're weirdos. But
you mean the old film Deliverance, not the new one? Okay.
The old one, yeah. So yeah, we pull up, and this house is just, there's no lights on, there's no electricity. It's just back in the woods, in the middle of nowhere in the mountains. The front porch is hoarded with stuff. A little, like, you walk in the house, there's no walls. Like, you can see through the walls, you can see the bed and the kitchen. And I'm like, what the heck? So this girl, Jessica, Blake, and Kim were there. And I'm like, so yeah, I'm like, you live here? And she's like, yeah. She's like, this is my old house. This is the house I grew up in. And I'm like, that's kind of weird. Now I think that she was spotting, because there's something in the news where she lived somewhere else, but she was squatting, not spotting, squatting.
What if there was something in the Appalachian Mountains that hunts you at night, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? In the deep, dark woods of Appalachia, there's a creature that some locals call the crawler. Descriptions vary, but one thing's for sure: it's no creature of the light. With pale, sickly skin, elongated limbs, and a twisted, contorted body, It moves in ways that defy nature. The crawler's most terrifying feature is its face, or lack of one. Its head is often described as being featureless, with a gaping mouth, filled with rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Some say it mimics the sound of a human voice, calling out in the night, drawing people deeper into the wilderness before revealing its horrifying form. Others have seen it clinging to trees or slithering across the ground with its head held low, jerking in unnatural ways like it's more monster than man. But the most terrifying part? The crawler doesn't just follow, it hunts, moving silently through the trees until it's right behind you. And when you realize it's chasing you, it's already too late. Locals who have crossed paths with it claim it's not just an urban legend, but a terrifying reality that still haunts the area today. And while the creature's origins remain a mystery, many believe it's been stalking these woods for generations, its presence a constant fear for anyone brave enough to venture too deep into the mountains.
Scary Creatures Caught in Appalachia, Part 2.
Out the hard way why you don't go wandering around the Smoky Mountains if you don't know where you're going. In the early 2000s, this Ohio couple just graduated high school, and they were going to spend the summer in Charleston, South Carolina with the guy's brother. They really wasn't on any kind of time schedule making their way from Ohio to Charleston, so along the way they would often stop at hiking trails and famous landmarks and just enjoy each other's company while taking in all the beautiful scenery. When they reached Tennessee, they took the drive through the Smoky Mountains, and this particular day it was starting to get dark, and they decided they would just pull over and find somewhere to sleep for the night. Getting dark, and they didn't really know the area that well. They didn't want to pay for a hotel. They just drove along the back roads in the Smoky Mountains until they found an old, grown-up logging road. Being very outdoorsy and loving nature and hiking, they wasn't intimidated by the Smoky Mountains or wildlife or forest. They were very comfortable in making the decision of just pulling off to sleep. So after a few days of being on the road, when they finally put the truck in park and turned the engine off, they reclined their seats back and just tried to get some sleep. The lady ended up falling asleep pretty quickly again because they were tired. The guy, he had trouble. He couldn't really get comfortable in his reclined seat, and so he just kind of tossed and turned for a little while. At one point, he even considered getting out and getting the tent out of the truck and just setting up tent next to the truck to camp so he could hopefully sleep. But he just got that gut feeling, it probably wasn't a good idea. So he just opted to stay in the truck, and eventually he did fall asleep. Around 2 a.m., his girlfriend woke up because she heard what sounded like somebody or something walking around the truck. She reached over to wake up her boyfriend and told him to listen, and he also began to hear it, but then it quit. It stopped all of a sudden. They assumed it was probably a black bear or maybe a deer. Didn't really think a lot about it, so they just laid back down and tried to go back to sleep. About 15 or 20 minutes later, the girlfriend was woke up again by what sounded like this time multiple people or creatures walking around the outside of the truck. Again, she reached over and woke up her boyfriend, and he also heard it. And so he didn't really know what to do because he didn't have any kind of weapon. And he's still thinking it's probably some kind of animal, even though it sounded like people. He decided he would just turn the headlights on to see if anything was in front of the truck. When he done that, That's when he seen what appeared to be 4 people standing about 20 yards in front of their truck. But these just wasn't ordinary people. He said these people looked like something straight out of a movie. They were covered from head to toe in mud, just very stringy and dirty hair, and they were just staring at them through the windshield about 20 yards away. Immediately they knew this was not right. They needed to leave, but they were in a huge F-150, Ford F-150 truck, the big tires, and they were on this little narrow road, so he couldn't just whip it around to turn to get away. So he did throw the truck into gear, he threw it in reverse, and he started to back up, and every time the headlights would kind of go off those people, they would start coming toward the truck closer. And at this point, they're starting to freak out. He don't want to make any sudden, quick turns or anything because he don't really know the area. He don't want to, cut it too deep and get caught in a ditch or hit something. So he's very slowly trying to maneuver to back up and also watch these people, because every time his headlights hit off of them, they start coming toward closer to the truck. This goes on for a couple minutes, and they're really starting to panic. And at one point, he turns a little quicker, a little more deep cut, and his headlight stays off for a little bit longer time period. And when he turns the truck back toward them, there's not just 4 of them this time. He said there's 11 or 12 of them. They are completely freaking out because now there's not just 4 people, there's 11 or 12 of them. They're in the middle of nowhere at 2:30 in the morning, in the middle of the Smoky Mountains, an area they don't know anything about, and this huge group of people is starting to surround their vehicle. The only thing he knows to do at this point is just try to back out of this road completely because he can't turn. And so it's just a slow process because at this time there are no rear view cameras, there's no backup cameras. He's just relying on his side mirrors and the old-fashioned way of turning around to look, but he can't really see anything. At one point, he realizes he hit something and his truck kind of bounces. He runs over something not knowing what it was. The tires start to spin. He didn't remember running over anything on the way in, but now he's trying to figure out what this is because those people are just getting closer to the truck. So he decides to put it back in drive, and he pulls forward really quickly. He guns it, and that's when he hops back over, and he's able to see this point that there's a tree laying across the road. And as he throws it back in reverse and guns it backwards again, he can see actually that this tree had been freshly cut. It wasn't there when they pulled in, but these people, or someone with these people, had cut this tree down. He knows that now they're truly in danger because these people are obviously trying to trap them in this little area. So as quickly as he can, but still very slowly, he just stays in reverse the whole way. And these people are just staying out of the headlights' reach, just enough where they are illuminated. But they're following this truck all the way out. After several grueling minutes, he gets close to the road again because he can start to see headlights go by. And all the while, these people are still following from a distance. Eventually, he does make it back to the road, and he throws it in drive and shoots out of there.
People held on to these stories for decades. Her daddy seeing it while hunting was one thing, but he had already been told about it because she had seen it not once but twice. I'm going to tell you about the second time. It was winter in the late 1960s, deep in the Appalachian Mountains. And the daughter from the previous story, who actually told me all these stories, was around 8 to 10 years old this time. She had her little cousin stay over to spend the night, and they were playing dress up, playing house, just being little girls. But you gotta remember, these are Appalachian girls, so they're tough. So they knew if they stayed up late, they had to keep that wood stove going. That meant going out back to the wood pile in the middle of the night and getting the wood and bringing it in and keeping the stove going. So that's just what they did. Her and her cousin went outside real quick. It was cold. Snow was on the ground, she said. They were going to gather whatever they could up in their arms. Now let me set the scene for you. The way this road is made, it's a 7-mile straight road. Dead center of a valley. So directly behind her house is nothing but woods and straight up a ridge. They get to the wood pile. They start gathering wood. She starts putting it in her cousin's arms. All of a sudden, they start hearing tapping. But I don't mean tapping, I mean thumping. Now for her, this was a different sound that she'd ever heard before. Her and her cousin both kind of just stared at each other, wondering, what was that? Was it you? Was it me? Did someone drop a piece of wood? Then it goes silent. So they just keep gathering up their wood. And I mean, you are in the Appalachian Mountains, you can hear anything in the woods at night. But all of a sudden, she hears it on the complete opposite side of the house, a deep, loud thump, wood on wood thump. She always told me she didn't know if it was a threatening thing or a get your attention thing. She said in that moment, all the thoughts of the first time she saw this thing started to run through her mind. She had her back to the woods, and she said all of a sudden her cousin's eyes were as big as a deer in headlights. She was staring directly where that sound was coming from, and now it was right behind them. She immediately turns around to look, and she said what she saw was what she thought was a man well over 6.5 feet tall, but covered head to toe in white, long, straight hair. Head to toe. She'd already seen this before, and it had terrified her, and she hoped she'd never see it again. They dropped the wood, they took off running back inside, locked the doors, peeked out the windows, never seen nothing else. They were afraid to tell because they'd already stayed up too late and snuck anyway. They weren't supposed to be up that late. They were already supposed to have that wood inside so they didn't have to go outside in the middle of the night. So they sat there in fear, worrying, where'd it go? What was it? What did we just see? Not knowing what to believe, but she knew she'd already seen it before. And she said as they sat there on her bed that night, they continuously heard that loud thumping noise of wood on wood. But just like her daddy's experience, the sound would travel from one end of the house to the other so fast, so loud that it made no sense whatsoever how something could make such a loud noise but go such a far distance so fast, unless there was more than one. But I guess we'll never know. Her first experience of this is absolutely an unbelievable story. That's why she kept it to herself for so many years. When I went around a couple of years ago asking people in the area, they had never told some of these stories.
It's getting really fucking cold out here, guys.
There was this man named Roy. Now, Roy lived in North Carolina. He grew up in the Appalachian Mountains, and he was known around town as a moonshiner. Now, and he said he kept getting busted, and they kept finding his stills and shutting him down. So Roy goes and talks to this Native American in town who he knows. And this man knew the area like really, really well. And Roy starts asking him, is there a spot that would be deep in the woods that would conceal like me setting up a still and stuff? He goes on to tell him, well, my people know of a place, and we do not go there. It's considered forbidden. And he said, there are bad things that happen there, but we cannot speak about it. But if you go there, no one will find you. It's about a 2-day hike, and I'll draw a map for you. It's fine. He gets a couple guys, and they set off to the spot in the mountains. First day, they're hiking through this thick brush, and, everything's going good. The second day, he said they got to some, like, really, really thick brush, and you could hardly see, a couple feet in front of you. And so all of a sudden, they heard, like a scurrying sound of something very large, like moving through the woods. And he said the whole day they were hiking out to the spot, they kept hearing the... So they finally make it to the spot that they had drawn on the map. And one of the things that Roy noticed was there was this clearing. And within the clearing were these large holes that looked like they had been filled in with dirt. They were like 3 foot, 4 foot wide. And he said all of a sudden they started to hear something moving through the woods. And he thought at the time it was like another person or something. Out of the woods comes a deer. The deer seemed very skittish and kind of like scared and nervous as it walked through this clearing. And he said all of a sudden it went by one of these holes that was like filled in with dirt. And it stood there for a second, stared at them, and the next thing they knew, something came out of the ground and it dragged it under the ground. And they're kind of like, what just happened? What just happened? And so Roy walks over to this hole that's like filled in with dirt. And he sees like 4 things kind of sticking out of the dirt. And he said the best way to describe it was it looked like a pipe cleaner. Like these pipe cleaners were sticking out of the ground, but they were, the size of a baseball round. And he said all of a sudden they started moving. And that's when he realized these were the legs of spiders. Grabs his guys and is like, hey, we got to get out of here. We got to leave. And they're like, what's going on? What's going on? And Roy said then he had to decide, because it was getting dark, do they hike through the woods at night or do they camp somewhere? Decided they would camp. They set up their tents and everything and make a campsite. That night, while they were camping, all night long, he said they could hear like scurrying and hissing sounds like all around them. The next morning when they get up and they get out of their tent, he said their campsite was completely covered in spider webs. And he felt that them staying in the tents actually saved them, because he felt like it confused whatever these large spiders or whatever they were.
Here in the Appalachian Mountains of southern West Virginia, and about the night.
Y'all, the lady that's coming up is literally talking about an area, literally, it's like my hometown. You know how you just have different, like, counties? That county is literally right there. And that place is very, very eerie. And I heard a lot of strange things happen up there, and a lot of evil things, too. And a lot of racist things as well. Still to this day, allegedly. Listen to this.
1980s, my mom...
All right, so if we're going to tell tales old folks told, my mom told me the story about my papa. She said that when he was coming down Balsam Mountain Road in Balsam, North Carolina, which is a very remote place, and if you know anything about western North Carolina, you know how remote it can get. Well, they lived in a place called Dark Ridge in Balsam, North Carolina, which is now a neighborhood outside of Silva, which is about half an hour outside of Asheville to the west. So very remote, very much in the mountains, and it was way back in the day, so this is very rural. Okay, now that we've got the setting covered, my papa is driving his old pickup truck down this back mountain road. It's Balsam Mountain Road, and he is minding his own, and suddenly this apparition pops into his seat, and he is a white devil. I mean, shock white, like white paint, titanium white, and he's got hair that stands straight up and electric blue eyes, and he looks like he's got electricity coming off of him, and he's got sharp teeth, and he is just cackling and screaming and cackling at my papa. Now, papa, I guess, had some stones, because there wasn't any place to pull over, so he rides down the mountain with this apparition cackling and screaming at him when I would have kicked that door open. Been like, oh no. But he rides down the mountain with this thing, and as he crosses the railroad tracks and the creek, it disappears. Grandma said he came home shaking. Now, he was white as a sheet. Now, my papa was 6'4" and wasn't scared of nothing and fought in World War II. So he was not the type of man that was going to be worried about anything on that mountain. Except this.
Here in the
There was this...
Avoid.
This video?
He was living in the...
Hi guys, I'm going to tell you some creepy things that have personally happened to me while living in the Appalachian Mountains. So, my family cemetery is across the road from my parents' house, but they own all the property, and it's pretty close to their house. And when my grandfather passed away and he was buried up there, every night there would be like a flickering light up around his grave, and there was no lights up there, like no solar lights, nothing like that. And it happened for a couple years, and then eventually it stopped, but it always happened at the same time every night. So, kind of creepy. At my parents' house, they had wooden rocking chairs outside on the porch, and they rock by themselves sometimes at night. Also, my parents, they built a log cabin, and that's where I grew up. And log cabins, whenever there's temperature changes, the logs constantly expand and contract. So we're assuming this is what it was, but one night, it was late at night and we was all asleep, and there's just constant like thumping outside of the house. Like, it was so loud, it was deafening, and it was probably one of the scariest things, because we honestly have no idea what it was, but I couldn't even describe the sound because it was so creepy. And the only thing we could think of is it was probably the logs expanding and contracting because it was really, really cold. It was actually came an ice storm, so that's what we think it was. A few years ago, a distant family member passed away, but they lived up the same holler that I used to live up, and the moment that they took their last breath, the power went off in the whole holler. Hi guys, I'm going to tell you some...
Alright.
There's a place in the Appalachian Mountains known as Devil's Hollow, where the fog never seems to lift, no matter the time of day. It's a place that locals avoid, and for good reason. In the early 1900s, a young man named Henry decided to hike through the hollow. Despite the warnings, he had heard the stories, of course, how people went in, only to disappear without a trace, but he didn't believe them. The allure of the uncharted land was too strong. So he packed his bag and set off alone. By midday, the fog had already begun to roll in. It wasn't thick at first, just a mist that clung to the trees. But as the hours passed, it grew denser, swallowing everything around him. He could barely see a few feet ahead, and that's when he started hearing the faint sound of footsteps behind him. At first, he thought it was his imagination, the eerie quiet playing tricks on his mind. But then the footsteps grew louder. Closer. Panicking, Henry broke into a run, heart pounding in his chest. The fog seemed to chase him, closing in tighter with every step. He stumbled into a small clearing, his breath ragged, when he heard a voice, soft and cold, whisper from the mist. Turn around. He froze, terror rooting him to the spot. The footsteps had stopped, but the voice, it was close, too close. He turned slowly, but saw nothing in the swirling fog. The voice came again, this time sharper, more insistent. Turn around. With no other choice, Henry spun around. The fog parted just enough for him to glimpse a figure standing behind him, a tall, shadowy form, its face obscured. The moment their eyes met, a chill gripped his soul. The figure's eyes were hollow, black pits, and its mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. You're not alone here, it hissed. Henry tried to scream, but the fog swallowed him whole, and he was never seen again. The next morning, searchers found his trail, but it ended abruptly at the edge of the hollow. There was no sign of him, only the whispering wind through the trees, as if the forest itself was calling him home. To this day, anyone who enters Devil's Hollow knows one thing. If you hear the voice, it's already too late.
If y'all have been watching this to this point, I have noticed 3 movies. Arachnophobia from the spiders in the Appalachians. The Mist, hello, Devil's Hollow, and The Fog, hello, Devil's Hollow. Okay.
Well, folks, the 1800s saw a boom in people settling down all over these old hills here in the Appalachians. You had farmers from Europe coming over, settling the land, raising crops and livestock. They also brought that old world superstition with them. You see, life in the mountains were good for a while, until it wasn't. And in the area known as Big Stone Gap today, some farmers found firsthand what it was like when life was rough. See, they started to notice their cattle was being slaughtered. Not just that, the strangest ways, cattle had been drained of the blood. Those old beliefs, they started to think they had a vampire amongst them. And they knew just who it was. This fellow by the name of Mr. Rupp. Now, for some reason or another, he just did not vibe with them. But that's all it was. Small town gossip, and we know how that breeds. Then one day a farmer found his 2 prized cattle drained of all their blood, and something had to be done. So, a small little posse formed, and they went out to Rupp's cabin. They looked through the window one night, and they saw this man sitting by the fireplace eating raw meat. But you see, the thing is, I like a little raw meat when I order my steak. I like it medium rare to rare. Nothing wrong with that. But it didn't sit right with those people. So, sheriff couldn't do anything about it, and they let the matter go. And one day, town drunk disappeared, and some people went out searching for him. You know where they found him? Out near Rupp's property. They brought the sheriff and everybody. They stormed that cabin. Mr. Rupp was nowhere to be found. You know what they found? A whole gore scene. Something straight out of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, A House of a Thousand Corpses. They had body parts scattered about, dismembered, been eaten on, it looked like. They never found old Mr. Rupp. I say he could be out there still. I don't know. Was he truly the first Appalachian vampire?
If you were freaked out by the movie The Descent, you might want to skip this video.
Dude, the mystery deepens. We hear water down there too. There's like a whole river down there or something. Maybe it's a cave, but we think it's an abandoned mine because we see a metal pipe down there. So unless the end of this casing just fell off, we got a lot of comments that said maybe this is like a well casing or something. Maybe that just fell off down there, but I don't know. Let's we got a brighter flashlight. Let's see what we can see. All right, sending it.
If you were freaked
I don't care what nobody says. Put in earbuds, baby, you can hear breathing. I'm not saying it's anything scary, but I'm just saying who in the hell laying down there? Yeah, it could be somebody homeless. But more than likely in the Appalachians, it's feral people. I mean, they have the right to live up there. I mean, honestly, I kind of wish I was feral. So I wouldn't have to be down here in this shit. I wouldn't know nothing about this bullshit of a world. And if you came up into my part, no matter who or what you look like, you would just be considered an outsider. Because I don't even think they even have racism up there, to be honest. I just think it's their land versus you not coming on it. Let's roll. And to make it very, very clear, to make this very, very clear, I mean, I'd rather be feral minus, the inbreeding and incest, because, baby, ain't nobody trying to do that. I just want to let people know, because there's some people out there that really probably thought that I'm down with that stuff, but we know how ignorant the world can be, and I'm from the mountains, and people already think we don't read books. Well, I just know that I don't want to date my family members. Okay, we're going back to the regular video.
Blood Mountain lies deep in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains and is also shrouded in creepy folklore. As you hike along the winding trails, the dense forest seems to close in around you, blocking out the sun's rays. The crunch of leaves underfoot is the only sound, until you hear a wailing sound, real or imagined. That's when the old-timers' tales come flooding back about the wailing woman. Legend has it she was a young mother who lost her mind after losing her baby on these very paths decades ago. Her anguished cries echoing through the valleys are a reminder of her eternal torment. Some say if you follow the wails, you'll spot her ghostly figure, eternally searching in vain.
This is proof that you just never know what is in the hills of Appalachia. This actually happened to her great-grandparents, I'm assuming probably many years ago. It was a warm summer night. Her great-grandmother and great-grandfather laid down to bed to go to sleep. Sometime around 3:30 a.m., something woke her grandmother up. And when she looked down to the end of the bed, that's when she seen it. Just at the foot of her bed was a very small man with a red beard. Now, my first thought when I heard this was a leprechaun. That's what you traditionally think of a lot of times when you think of a leprechaun. But she said this small man with a red beard was just standing there staring at her. She woke her husband up, this lady's great-grandfather, and asked him if he seen this man, and he also seen the man with the red beard. But as quickly as he was there, he was gone. He vanished. At that point, this lady's great-grandmother and grandfather got up out of bed to go look for this little man with the red beard, and he was nowhere to be found. And she said that her grandmother always referred to this little man as a troll, a real troll. Hiker learned the hard way that Smoky Mountain legends are real. My buddy and follower Nick, who is an experienced hiker, he's hiked the Appalachian Trail, pretty much the whole United States, but just outside Gatlinburg in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, he experienced something that absolutely scared him to death. He set out on this hike in the Gatlinburg area, and he said he put in 12 to 14 miles this day, and as night approached, he made camp. It was the time of year when the weather was getting hot. He decided not to use a tent, and he just took a hammock. He did say that this particular night, it was the full moon. You could actually see pretty well. And so he actually found a little clearing next to a little creek, and I'll show a picture in just a moment, where he ended up putting his hammock. He had previously found a little shelter he started to use, but he said he just kind of got a bad feeling about it, so he opted for the hammock instead. It was around 10:30 when he crawled into his hammock, and he also said he put the rain cover up to keep the moonlight out. He said he didn't need it. It was a very clear night, but the moon was so bright, he put this cover up so he could sleep. Around 1:30 a.m., something woke him up, and he quickly discovered that it was something scratching on his rain cover on the hammock. His first thoughts was, this is a bear. There's a bear scratching on my hammock. So he slowly looked over to where he could see, and he immediately recognized that this thing was bipedal. It was standing on 2 feet. But he also quickly noticed that this thing was barefoot, and he said that its feet were just very odd and very unhealthy looking. He then noticed this thing's nails as it was scratching the rain cover, and he said that they were just something horrific. He said this thing had nails anywhere between 4 to 6 inches long, and it was just constantly scratching at his rain cover. He didn't have any kind of firearm. He said some states are kind of weird about the out-of-state people bringing in weapons, but he did have a large knife, and he slowly reached for it and started to very meticulously unzipping his hammock so he could exit the other side. He finally got this thing unzipped and very quietly and slowly rolled out the opposite side of this creature, whatever it was, and he landed on the ground as quiet as he could. With his knife in hand, he slowly stood up to try to see what this thing was, and it was something that absolutely sent chills down his spine. Just on the other side of this hammock, he was now almost face to face with this thing. He said it was just a solid, dark, black figure with glowing red eyes. When he clearly seen this creature, he said he immediately just took a step back, and just in an instant, this thing was gone. It completely vanished. He's thinking to himself, this is Spearfinger. This is the legend of Spearfinger. It has to be. It's something that I've heard about, and with these long nails that are 4 to 6 inches long, it's got to be Spearfinger. So he quickly took his hammock down. He packed up his stuff in the middle of the night, and he said he headed out of there. He said he hiked quicker that night than he had ever hiked in his life. He eventually made his way back to Gatlinburg, where he found a hotel, and he said he just had to take a couple days just to process this whole encounter, this situation, because he couldn't make sense of it. During his stay in Gatlinburg over those next couple or 3 days, he actually ran into a few more hikers, and at that point they all stayed together. But what was really interesting, these other hikers had actually been camping not too awfully far from where he was at the same night, and they were sleeping in a tent, and they experienced the exact same thing. Something was standing outside their tent, just softly scratching it, just like they had his hammock.
I went camping in the Appalachian Mountains. I still can't believe what I witnessed. In my early 20s, I made it a tradition to camp out in the Appalachians at least once every 2 or 3 months. This trip started out like any other. I found a nice camping spot and had begun setting up my tent, when I noticed a wooden structure maybe 100 yards deeper into the woods. I've found it's important to check these kinds of places out before making camp. Abandoned houses out here make perfect spots for homeless camps and drug dens. It appeared to be what was left of a house. I'm no expert, but I would guess it was built in the mid to late 1800s. The whole structure consisted of a door, a few rotting beams, and a handful of old square nails holding the walls together. Beyond the house, I noticed a couple of headstones sticking up through the brush. After a closer look, it seemed to be an old family plot. The headstones were smooth and didn't have any writing, so I couldn't really get any info from them. The whole place made me a little uneasy, but I brushed it off. Satisfied with my check of the area, I returned to finish setting up camp. After setting up, I had some dinner and spent several hours just enjoying the solitude of the woods. As the sun began to set, I hopped into the tent and drifted off to sleep. Around 3 a.m. I woke up to the sound of screaming. My first thought was it had to be something, but the more I listened, the less sure I became. Something sounded uniquely human about it. As I listened, I noticed another sound between the screams. It sounded exactly like a woman crying. Whoever it was couldn't have been far from my tent. I was in a bit of a pickle. On the one hand, it seemed like whoever was out there might need help, but on the other, if it was some crazy woman on drugs, it was in my best interest to be nowhere near her. I decided I'd hike far enough back to get some decent cell service and call the authorities to come. Take a look. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and began to creep away. Once outside, I could hear a bit better and realized the woman wasn't alone. I could hear the hushed whispers of a conversation. To me, it sounded like another woman, but it was hard to tell. I turned and started walking in the opposite direction to try and distance myself from them. I hadn't gotten more than 200 yards from the tent when I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. A large dark shadow was moving silently through the woods, maybe 50 feet in front of me. I instinctively dropped to the ground and tried my best not to move or make a sound. As the shadow got closer and my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I noticed it was a man. He was very large, at least 6'5", well over 300 pounds. He appeared to be carrying a hammer and had a sickening smile that seemed to envelop most of his face. I was horrified. I laid there and held my breath. For as large as he was, he moved in complete silence. The seconds felt like hours. Eventually he passed by me and continued deeper into the woods. Once the coast was clear, I ran full speed for the car. As I ran, the shrieks I had heard before started up again, but this time even more frantic and blood-curdling. The screams continued all the way back to the car. I had never run so fast in my life. When I got to the car, I locked the doors and phoned the police. They conducted a thorough search of the area but found nothing. I was baffled. They suggested I go home and get some rest and come back in the morning to get my camping equipment. I was more than willing to do that. Even being safe and in my own bed, I couldn't sleep. But when the sun came out, I reluctantly went back to grab my stuff. Thankfully, they sent an officer to escort me. As I packed up the equipment, I noticed the door to the old house had fallen completely off the hinges, and I knew it hadn't been like that the day before. I mentioned this to the officer, and he went to take a closer look. A few minutes went by when I heard the officer shout for me to come over. He asked if I had seen this the first time, pointing to the gravestones. I went white when I noticed 2 new gravestones next to the others. You could tell by the way the soil had been disturbed that these graves were fresh. From there I was taken into the station to talk with investigators and give a full description of the man and the events of that night. They assured me they would update me with any information on the case. I never heard back from them, but I was told by a buddy on the force that several bodies had been discovered and the police were trying to keep it quiet that there was a potential serial killer on the loose. I don't go camping anymore, and as far as I know, no one has ever been charged for the crime.
I have to tell y'all this story that someone sent me about their experience spending the night at the Devil's Tramping Grounds in North Carolina in the Appalachian Mountains. If you don't know, the Devil's Tramping Grounds has been the subject of local lore and legends for generations. Some say that objects left in the circle before dusk will be moved outside of the circle by dawn. I also read that dogs will whimper and dig their heels into the sand if they're brought anywhere near the circle. Living in North Carolina, he had grew up hearing about the Devil's Tramping Grounds his entire life. He's a paranormal investigator, so him and one of his team members decided they were going to go spend the night one night. He said the Devil's Tramping Grounds in the daytime feels like any other set of woods that you'll ever enter. But when the sun starts to go down, you can feel the energy change. They got there and set up their tent and got the fire started and decided it was time to go for a walk before it got completely dark. They started walking down the main trail and they came to a set of 4 trees that all had burn marks all at the same height. They were physically unable to walk through this set of trees. They tried and tried, but it felt like they were being pushed back out by something. They had to go off trail to go around these trees and they just kept going. The rest of the walk was going pretty normally, except they noticed that there were absolutely no animal sounds. Which if you know, you know. After about 2.5 hours of walking, they finally started back to their campsite to eat some supper, and to set up some investigation equipment around the circle itself. They got the equipment set up and they were doing different investigation methods. After about 3 hours of that, it was around 3 a.m. He told his team member he was going to go out into the woods to grab some more firewood. He grabbed his walkie-talkie and told his team member that if anything happened, he would call him, and if anything happened to him, he should do the same. He made it about 50 yards into the woods when he started hearing very loud footsteps. He could tell it was something on 2 feet, so he kind of figured it was his team member running to catch up, so he figured he'd just stop and wait on him. When all of a sudden, he heard a loud scream coming from their campsite. His walkie-talkie went off and his team member, who was a former Marine, was in pure panic. He called back telling him that he was on his way, but he had just had a reconstructive foot surgery, so he wasn't moving that fast. When he got back to their camp, he noticed that their tent had been taken down in a hurry. He could tell that he just grabbed what he could as fast as possible and ran down to the cars, which were parked on the side of the road about 30 yards away from the circle. He made his way down to the cars and he asked his team member what had happened. His team member said that he was sitting with his back towards the trail that he had just walked down, and he started hearing movement and he thought it was just him at first, so he just kind of ignored it. Then there was like a big limb, like a tree branch, thrown into the camp. Then he heard heavy footsteps running towards the campsite, so he jumped up, grabbed everything he could as fast as he possibly could, and ran down to the cars. They talked for a while, and he told his team member that they still needed to go back up there and get all the equipment that they had left. You know, if he didn't want to spend the night, they still needed to go get their stuff. His team member looked at him and told him he wasn't going back up there no matter what. So he told him just to go ahead and start putting what he had brought down there to the cars with him away, and he would go back to the campsite and grab everything they had left. So he walks back to the campsite, grabbing all the remaining stuff, when all of a sudden he starts getting that feeling that you feel when somebody's looking at you. Noticed a rustling sound coming from the tree line on the trail that he had originally been on. He took his flashlight and was scanning the tree line when he froze. No more than 25 feet in front of him, right in the tree line, was a black mass that stood at least 7 foot tall with bright red glowing eyes. He said he stood there for what felt like forever, and it would only move a couple of feet left or a couple of feet right, which he felt like was this thing's way of telling him that he wasn't welcome. This was its property and he needed to leave. He started walking slowly backwards all the way down to the cars, but he never took his flashlight off of it and he never turned his back to whatever it was.
What is really happening in the Appalachian Mountains? Back in 2016, a solo hiker named Sebastian embarked on a journey along the Appalachian Trail. As the sun was setting, he lit up a campfire and began cooking a hot meal. As Sebastian was eating, he noticed the forest get completely silent. He began to feel as if he was being watched. He brushed it off and retrieved to his tent. As Sebastian prepared for sleep, he was startled by the sound of what sounded like a child whispering. Confused, he grabbed his flashlight and stepped out, expecting to see a lost child who might need help. He pointed his beam in the direction of the voice. A young boy stood about 10 feet away, his back turned to Sebastian. The boy's clothing appeared outdated, reminiscent of the late 19th century, or where his parents are. The boy then turns around to lock eyes, revealing an awful set of pure dark, black eyes. A sense of pure evil came from the boy. He did not act human-like. Frozen in shock, Sebastian hesitated, not knowing what to do. The boy then points into a direction in the forest and says, "Come, my parents are in the forest. They want to meet you." Sebastian reaches for his backpack inside his tent, ready to run. As he glances back in the direction of the boy, he's gone. Fighting the urge to leave in the dark, he decides to stay awake a couple more hours until the sun rises. At sunrise, Sebastian leaves the Appalachian Trail completely terrified of his encounter. What do you guys think? Was this a real encounter with a black-eyed child?
You guys, I'm hearing that fucking scream, sound, whatever it is again. I'm inside my house, so don't worry. I was just sitting here, about to start watching something on my phone. I woke up from a nap a little bit ago, and I hear it inside my house. That's how loud it is. At times, it almost sounds like somebody's like scream talking. I'm really not too sure. All I know is I'm super uncomfortable living here. And for those of you who don't know, we're in the middle of nowhere. And this is the second time now that I'm hearing this.
It snows in the Appalachian Mountains.
Man, something fucking screaming down there, man. Where are you?
The most mysterious places in America hides itself in these woods, far away from the public eye in one of the most enchanting mountain ranges in the country, the Appalachian Mountains, home to age-old myths and modern ghost stories. Within these mountains, there is also a hidden border they call the Quiet Zone,